Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Finbar Anderson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. A century ago, on 8th June 1924, George Mallory and his young companion Andrew Irvine set out for what they hoped would be a historic first summit of Mount Everest. After several unsuccessful attempts since 1921, Mallory had written home, "We are going to sail to the top this time and God with us, or stamp to the top with the wind in our teeth." Noel Odell, a talented climber and the expedition's geologist, followed the pair's progress from the camp below and noted shortly after midday, "There was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere above me, and I saw the whole summit ridge and final peak of Everest unveiled. I noticed far away on a snow slope leading up to what seemed to me to be the last step but one from the base of the final pyramid, a tiny object moving and approaching the rock step. A second object followed, and then the first climbed to the top of the step. As I stood intently watching this dramatic appearance, the scene became enveloped in cloud." Mallory and Irvine were never again seen alive, and their death sparked one of the mountain's great mysteries. Were they the first to reach the summit of Everest and died on the descent? Or did they never even reach the top? My guest today is the anthropologist and writer Wade Davis. He served as explorer-in-residence with the National Geographic Society from 2000 to 2013 and is the author of Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory and the Conquest of Everest. In the book, he situates the early attempts on Everest by Mallory and his colleagues in the context of British imperial ambitions as well as the raw horror of the First World War, which many of the expedition's members had witnessed firsthand. Wade Davis, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Finbar.
So, Wade, this wasn't the first successful recorded attempt on Everest, and that would be achieved some 30 years later by Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary in 1953. So, what is it about these earlier expeditions that continues to capture people's imaginations even to this day?
Well, I think for one, in 1920, to attempt to get to the top of Mount Everest was almost analogous to trying to reach the surface of the moon. It was absolutely unknown what the conditions would be there. Would people be able to breathe? What would be the winds and so on? But also, I think it's the character of the men who made these efforts that is so enchanting, particularly today in a culture consumed by self. These were remarkable men of discretion and decorum. And in many ways, they had been through such extraordinary experiences. And in many ways, Everest has always been kind of a Rorschach of the sensibilities of Britain, particularly during its century of decline from empire. And if you think about it, the initial attempt to get to the top of Everest was, in a sense, a mission of redemption for an empire of explorers who had famously, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, lost the race to the South and North Poles. And Everest, looming over the Raj, was seen to be the third pole. And in many ways, a much more challenging prospect, because it's one thing to trudge across a horizontal surface of ice and snow in freezing temperatures. It's quite another to climb across a slope that brings you into a zone of oxygen deprivation so severe that you cannot survive. And then in the wake of the Great War, in a way, the quest for Everest became a mission of regeneration for an entire generation that had been bled white by the conflict. And then in the 1930s, after a hiatus of a decade, when the Brits returned to Everest on 4 expeditions, the first was quite successful, but the other 3, 35, 36, 38, were not just failures, they were kind of like embarrassing failures, and they became almost symbolic of Britain's futility on the eve of Hitler's war. And then finally, when Tenzing and Hillary summit in 1953, it becomes a hugely symbolic moment because these aren't the lads from Oxford and Cambridge who had been recruited by the Everest Committee to assault the mountain in the 1920s and indeed the 30s. These were a humble beekeeper from the far reaches of empire, and a Sherpa. And the extraordinary thing is because neither Hillary nor Tenzing were prepared to say who got to the summit first of the two of them. That gesture was sort of a slap in the face of every colonial conceit that lingered in the remnants of the British Empire. It was kind of an inversion of what it meant to be colonized or be the colonizer. And it became a tremendous symbol of India's new autonomy. And that's why Nehru embraced mountaineering with such zeal and set up the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Darjeeling, which would train all of India's great climbers. And so in that sense, the expeditions always were a reflection of what was going on in a greater British Empire. And that was always my interest in the story. I mean, I never really cared whether Mallory got to the top or not. I was interested in what was the spirit that carried these men aloft. And in some of the earlier books about the expedition, many of them are very fine books, but the military background of these men had been sort of glossed over with a phrase. Norton was a colonel in some regiment. But it seemed to me, as I first stood at the base of the Kanchung face, the east face of Everest, where you're standing on ground at Pithenringbo, higher than any in Europe, and yet looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice rising to the South Pole in 1996. My friend Dan Taylor, I was with, we were in the Gama Valley, and he suddenly began to speak of these Englishmen in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other at 25,000 feet, and I became completely enchanted. And it struck me that just knowing their age and their class and their education, it was almost certain that the vast majority, if not all, would have gone through the agony of the Western Front. And I knew enough about that war to sense that they would have seen so much of death that perhaps death had nothing more to teach them, no hold on them save that of their own, and that in some sense life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And maybe that's what not just propelled them up the flanks of Everest, but allowed them to accept a level of risk that would have been inconceivable in mountaineering before the war, but was a very level of commitment that Everest, we now know, demands of every expedition.
Let's move on to the mountain itself. I mean, I think today we maybe take it for granted a little bit that the tallest mountain in the world, it's in the Himalayas. We've given it this somewhat curious name that sounds a bit out of place if you compare it to some of its neighbours like Lhotse or Kangchenjunga, which I think was actually for many years assumed to be the highest mountain in the world. So when and how does Everest come to take on this name? And when does it take on this significance as well in the minds of colonial administrators as well as kind of young explorers?
Well, again, you cannot separate the mountain and the quest for the mountain from the unraveling or the unfolding of the British Empire. And the greatest scientific experiment of the 19th century, long forgotten, was a great trigonomical survey. And geographers knew that the Earth was not a perfect sphere, but the degree of the distortion was critical for navigation and for map making and so on. And so they set out beginning in 1806, carrying these theodolites, which were the finest scientific instruments of the century, these great 1,200-pound brass theodolites. And they literally carried them the length of India to measure a single line of latitude, and eventually, as they got to the Himalaya, they branched out in the survey east and west. And such was the wizardry of calculus and mathematics and the brilliance of the surveyors that they could literally scan across the Himalaya at all the snow peaks scraping the sky, and they could literally measure the heights of these from great distances. And when they came to the peak that we now know as Everest, they were able to calculate its height with a remarkable specificity. I think they were only off by about 60 feet or something like that. And this is from a distance in Darjeeling. Incredible. But ironically, the mountain was named for George Everest, as the name was pronounced, a cantankerous, much disliked man in India who was the head of the Survey of India. So it was his fate to have the highest mountain in the world named in his honor, but mispronounced for all time. And the mountain itself, particularly in the mind of Lord Curzon, took on a kind of imperial resonance. I mean, it had to be climbed by somebody British. And at the same time, what really mattered to the Raj was what lay beyond the mountain in Tibet. And this, of course, was the Great Game, or what the Russians called the Tournament of Shadows. And rumors persisted that Russian spies were in Lhasa. And the Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, kept refusing to return Curzon's diplomatic messages. The Brits in the end decided to invade. And the young husband invasion of 1903, I think it was, marched into Lhasa, didn't find any Russian influence, but managed to destroy the Tibetan army and awaken the wrath of the Chinese. And as a result of that, the Dalai Lama, having fled to Mongolia, fled back into the arms of Charles Bell, the frontier officer in Darjeeling. And that's how the situation was. And the problem was any attempt to climb Everest was foiled by the fact that Nepal was completely closed to outsiders, and to get to the mountain from Tibet, you needed the permission of the 13th Dalai Lama. And this is a man whose entire army has been destroyed by Maxim guns of the expeditionary force. And as young husband left Lhasa on a great retreat, he dispatched Cecil Rawling and F.M. Bailey to reconnoiter the mountain up the Brahmaputra. And they came very close to the mountain as they returned to India through Simla. And meanwhile, young husband himself, a kind of mystic warrior, wakes up one morning on the Tibetan plateau. The air clears, the sun rises, and he sees this incredible mountain soaring into the heavens, and he becomes almost mystified by it. And in fact, if some of the correspondents along with young husband's expeditions had sort of seen the violation of Lhasa as like the violation of the last pure place on earth, in a way, young husband transferred all that energy about the mystical city of Lhasa, and he transferred it onto Everest, and it became a symbol of more than mountaineering. It was a symbol of imperial desire, and in the last years before the whole thing came tumbling down in the mud and blood of Flanders. And so efforts to get to Everest began before the war. Young husband and General Bruce meeting on a polo field in Hunza, and a couple of characters like Alexander Kellis and of course John Noel sneaking in disguise into Tibet to try to get close to the mountain in 1913 and before. And there were plans to climb the mountain that were, of course, put on hold with the outbreak of the First World War. And during that war, of course, everything changed altogether. And one of the things I wanted to do, if I wanted to, in my book, suggest this idea, that for these men having gone through the war, that life mattered less than the moments of being alive, and maybe that explains why Mallory kept on walking even to his death. That's not something you could tell people. You had to show them. And so I had to really recreate the horrors of the war in that text. And the way I did it, in a sense, was enormous amounts of research. And so of the 26 men who went to Everest on those three expeditions, 1921, 22, and 24, it turned out 6 escaped the fighting. Sandy Irvine, too young; Longstaff, too old; Beetham, a school teacher; Guy Bullock, a diplomat, and so on. But 20 saw the worst of the fighting. Jack Hazard, who climbed to the North Pole in 1924, did so with open wounds from the Battle of the Somme 8 years before, still saturating his climbing tunic with blood.
I think for pretty much every single member of the expedition that does serve, you talk about where it was. You mentioned Charles Bruce, who was a survivor of Gallipoli, and said after going back after the war, I do not find myself in tune with the people of this country. What is it, do you think, about the war that makes these young men find an outlet in Everest?
I mean, one of the things was just the chasm between those who had fought and those who had sat at home imagining imperial glories. Stephen Spender, the poet, said in the wake of the war, the British middle class continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor had fallen out from beneath them. A good example is Arthur Wakefield, who was a physician on the 1922 expedition. He started the war a deep religious man. He was part of the Grenville mission in Newfoundland. He personally equipped the first 500 of the legendary Newfoundland Regiment, and he sailed with them to France. And as they peeled off to Gallipoli, he was sent to the front line, and he served like Somerville in a casualty clearing station. And by chance, he discovered on the eve of the Somme that his beloved boys of Newfoundland, and remember, he had been one of 2 physicians in all of Labrador, so he had brought every lad into the world, literally. And when he heard that they were back and by chance engaged with the 29th British Division, which by chance was right in front of his state hospital. In other words, he would be dealing with the wounded of both that division and of Newfoundland. And on the day of the Somme, it was all chaos, unclear what was going on. And in the wake of the battle, he walked and walked everywhere trying to find or hear the lilt of the Newfoundland accent to see anybody wearing the blue puttees of the regiment. And so it was like the entire regiment had disappeared. And in fact, it had disappeared because 910 men went over the top and only 37 survived to return. And so it was in that moment that I think Wakefield's religious faith cracked. And as his son would tell me, never again would he speak of God, see the inside of a church, and he would live his life with never speaking of the war. And again, this isn't as if people were talking about this on Everest. Of course they weren't, but it was part of their experience that clearly had influenced them deeply. How could it not? And to make this argument, I did a lot of research. And again, I'm never saying in the book that because of what happened in the war, anyone did any one thing on the mountain. But it is interesting that there are constant references to the war and the front in the diaries and in the reports, as Wheeler and Mallory, for example, with Bullock, for the first time summit the North Col in 1921. They described the wind as if blasts of artillery. The only way you could survive the wind of Everest was to slow down your mind, breathe between the gusts, just as you had to breathe between the percussive explosions of the shells all around you at the front. And when Mallory and Irvine are clearly dead, Norton famously writes, "We took the news with the rational dignities that we had learned to deal with in the Great War." Significantly, I think, as they leave Everest in 1924, one of the climbers looks out his tent and says this really beautiful thing about how yesterday Mallory and Irvine were living their proper game. Today it's over and they are gone. And somewhere up there, they are lying frozen in the snow and with ever having to face the possibility of decay. And could any man wish a finer fate? And of course, that's a direct reference to the carnage and the rot of the Western Front.
So the first expedition is in 1921. And describe for us what that's actually like.
Well, in 1921, obviously there are no roads and no way to get there by plane. It goes without saying. They literally left from Darjeeling and walked overland up through the leech-infested jungles of Sikkim, climbing slowly to the Tibetan plateau at Fari. It was a traditional trade route between Tibet and India. But once they got to the Tibetan plateau, the climbers had to turn west and literally as was said, walk off the map to come to close quarters with the mountain. And so that whole route had been unsurveyed. And they established themselves at a place called Tingri, rather. And they literally just had to ask around. And Wheeler began to explore the mountain from the west. They weren't allowed to cross into Nepal formally, but they would have been happy to do so if it provided an opening to the mountain. And they explored it straight up the heart to the West Rongbuk Glacier because they had heard about the old monastery there at Rongbuk. And eventually they tried to reconnoiter the mountain from the east through Karta, which eventually led them to Windy Gap. But the key thing to remember in terms of just the sport or the climbing at that time is that these were ridge walkers. Front-pointed crampons didn't exist, and the crampons that they had really were pretty debilitating at high elevation. They caused the feet to freeze. And so these climbers had to really find a saddle or a col that would lead to a ridge. It would lead to a ridge that would take you to the summit. And as Mallory and Bullock reconnoitered the Rongbuk Glacier, the West Rongbuk, they saw a col that seemed to lead to the northeast ridge. And it was unclimbable from the west. So the whole effort in 1921 was to try to find a way to get through this rugged knot of incredible mountains to see if there could be a point of access to the base of the North Col from the east. And eventually they made their way to the east side of the mountain, and they crossed several passes that took you into the Gama Valley, that took you up to the Kanchung face of Everest, which is the east face of the mountain, the highest face. It was not climbed, I think, until 1963. But that, Mallory took one look at that 2 vertical miles of ice. There was no way that was going to go with the capabilities they had in 1920 and the gear they had. But then they went up the Karta Valley, which is parallel to the Gama Valley, and reached eventually through snowfields and incredible exhaustion, a place they called Windy Gap or the Lakpala. And from there, you could look down over the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier to the North Col from the east. Now, the interesting thing is that Mallory that day wrote not once but twice to his beloved Ruth, basically saying, if we only knew where this glacier at my feet winds up going to, it would be the key to the mountain. Well, the truth is he was lying to Ruth because he already knew where that glacier went, because our man Oliver Wheeler had reconnoitered the inner massif of the mountain and found and followed the opening to the east Rongbuk Glacier, an opening that Mallory and Bullock had walked by and ignored not once but twice in their own explorations of that valley. And Oliver Wheeler had sent a note to expedition leader Howard Bury before Mallory got to the Lakpala, saying exactly where that glacier went and revealing it to be the key to the mountain. So in the end, it wasn't George Mallory who found the route up Everest in 1921. It was this unknown Canadian, Oliver Wheeler. And curiously, and I don't know why, because I'm a Canadian, I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but Mallory hated Canadians. And he was very disparaging towards Wheeler throughout the expedition, which was odd, because at a time when Mallory was turning somersaults as a schoolboy at Winchester, Oliver Wheeler was setting first records in the Canadian Rockies for first summits, and he was a formidable character. And in fact, when it came time to actually cross that head of the East Rongbuk Glacier and go up the North Col, getting to 23,000 feet, which was then as high as anybody had ever gone, oddly enough, which is one man on the expedition that Mallory chooses to go with him, Oliver Wheeler. And with Guy Bullock, they make that ascent, and it's a formidable accomplishment, but they nearly die, and they can't go any further. And in one of the most poignant moments in 1921, as they come down off the North Col, totally exhausted to their spike camp, Wheeler's feet are completely frozen, and George Mallory stays up all night rubbing Wheeler's feet with whale oil to keep him alive. And so in the end, clearly a bond was established between the two climbers.
And so they've successfully reconnoitred the mountain in this 1921 expedition. Give me a bit of context for 22 expedition and the 24 expedition. What's happening there?
They were quite sanguine. I mean, they had achieved everything they had set out to do. Wheeler's survey of the inner massif of the mountain had dramatically expanded understanding of not just the Everest massif and the surrounding valleys and mountains, but also of that whole kind of blank spot on the map of the approach march. And at the same time, they had found the route to the mountain. There was no question about it. That was going to be the way, because you could get to the North Col, go up the shoulder, get to the Northeast Ridge, and that led you straight to the summit pyramid. And even viewed from below through telescopes, they could see that there were only two impediments on that ridge. And this, by the way, speaks to a fundamental feature of Everest, which is why it's climbed by so many people, is that technically it's not that difficult a mountain. It really is a matter of acclimatization, good luck with the weather, and sheer grit and stamina. It's nothing like a technical mountain like K2. On the north side of Northeast Ridge, you had the first step and the second step. When they use the word step, it's just simply a vertical face of rock that has to be surmounted. And so they left in 1921 quite optimistic. And so when they returned in 22 with a new expedition leader and a new set of teammates, if you will, there were some repetitions. Of course, there was Mallory, but now we had a really powerful team. We had Howard Somerville. Colonel Norton was an incredible addition, and above all, George Finch, who was what Mallory was to rock, Finch was to ice and snow. And the real story of 1922, in a way, was oxygen. Those who stayed back in London and had never climbed anything higher than their desks saw oxygen as being unsporting, but those more scientifically inclined on the expedition, such as the physician Somerville or the chemist George Finch, saw that the use of oxygen was no more unsporting than seeking out the best pair of boots. I mean, oxygen, it's not as if, as Finch famously said, it puts wings on your feet. It just is an aid. And part of what was going on is that the people back in London, the old men who had escaped the war, they continued to speak about the assault on Everest through the language of war. But we had a young generation of actual climbers who had actually lived through a war where they had walked the edge of death every single day. And because of that, I think they were prepared to accept a level of risk on Everest that would have been inconceivable to mountaineers before the war, but was, as I said, the very risk, that commitment that Everest demanded. And what was clearly shown in 22, for reasons of bad judgment, Colonel Strutt allowed Mooreshead, Mallory, Norton, and Somerville to make an attempt at the mountain as a climbing party of four. They weren't aware, it seems, that there are no second chances on Everest. And because of that, when George Finch came to climb the mountain, there were no trained climbers to go with him. Now, that first effort by Mallory and all ended in near disaster, and only a heroic move by Mallory kept the four of them from being swept off the side of the mountain. But they all were injured or frostbitten or depleted by that effort. And then Finch comes along using oxygen, and he recruits to his colors Jeffrey Bruce, a transport officer, but a man who was very fit but had never been really on a mountain in his life, save to hunt. And yet, nevertheless, the two of them, using oxygen, went higher and faster than Mallory and closer to the summit than Mallory had managed to do. And if it hadn't been for a terrible storm that caused them to bivouac without provisions for 2 days, higher than any other man had ever slept, and the fact that Bruce's oxygen apparatus froze up and Finch had to heroically save the young lad's life, George Finch just might have gotten to the top in 22. And when he came down, Mallory, who had just seen his height record broken within a week, insisted on a third effort, even though people like Longstaff were desperately against it because of the time in the season, the snow, the condition of the snow. And sure enough, Mallory, I think in a rather petulant way, storms up the mountain, the North Col, with a climbing party and an avalanche does in fact happen and sweeps 7 Sherpas to their death. And so 1922 ends on a rather forlorn note. It takes time to organize a new expedition for 24. But again, they go out in 24, and again, they've got some new people on the team. Sandy Irvine, a young man, a ferociously strong athlete, and his mentor, Noel Odell, who had missed the earlier expeditions, but was an incredible climber, particularly of enormous stamina. And, it's sometimes asked why Mallory chose to climb with the inexperienced Irvine. But I think in some sense, Sandy, in all of his enthusiasm and vitality, represented to these older men the very reason that they had gone to war and the reason for which so many of their friends had died. And we have to remember that these men are coming from an era of almost mystic patriotism. They went through an experience that, in fact, birthed the nihilism of modernity, but they themselves were scions of another century, born in the 19th century, and they had no interest whatsoever in yielding their feelings to analysis or littering the world with themselves. They're a kind of man that I think we'll never know again. And yet the most amazing thing to recall, Finbar, is that these men were our grandfathers.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. So back to 1924, on the mountain, there are a couple of attempts made on the summit, but it's this final one, Mallory and Irvine, they set off on the 8th of June. What's it looking like? What do they need to do to overcome to reach the summit?
I think the first thing to understand in 24 is the enormous pressure on the expedition for success. The team in 1922 had been heralded. Each one of them was given Olympic gold medals. There was a famous Empire exhibit at Wembley, the centerpiece of which was a model of Mount Everest. The whole world was watching, if you will. And the pressure fell particularly on George Mallory, who was the only one who had gone on 3 expeditions. He had uttered that famous phrase, "Why do we climb Mount Everest? Because it's there." Now, the truth of the matter is he uttered that phrase at the end of a lecture on his 1923 lecture tour in New York, and it was a throwaway line to get rid of a bothersome fan who was keeping him from getting to a speakeasy and getting a drink after his lecture. But somehow that phrase, "because it's there," distilled something of the purity of the endeavor, of adventure, of exploration. And remember, this is a country that's been completely bled white. The running of the British Empire cost £500,000 a day. The Great War cost Britain £5 million a day. On the surface, Britain seemed to emerge from the war intact. Its cities hadn't been destroyed. Its navy was preeminent. It had the largest army in the world. And that all of this really had only birthed the nihilism of a new century, and the bankruptcy of a nation was invisible to those who still marched to the rhythms of empire. And indeed, the empire would continue to physically expand until 1935, when it reached its greatest geographical extent. But we now know that it never survived the war. So in a way, Britain was in search of heroes, and Mallory had been made into a hero. He was the face of the expedition. He was a very good public speaker. They had him on the road all the time. And so the pressure was intense. And hovering over 1924 as well, no doubt, was Mallory's, I wouldn't say guilt, but a collective sense of responsibility from all of them as to what had happened in 1922 when the 7 Sherpas and not a single Englishman had been swept to their death. And then 1924, they were so confident, but then something strange happened. And we now speculate that there was a kind of a really unusual low-pressure system that hovered all over the Karakoram and the Himalaya that year, and it created incredible snow conditions. And so in 1924, the expedition struggled for a month even to establish a camp, Camp 4 on the top of the North Col. And more than once, Norton had to order a full retreat. And at one point, they even came down to the Rongbuk Monastery and sought, for the sake of the Sherpa and the porters, and perhaps even for themselves, the blessings of the monastery at Zatarumshe, Narrantins and Norbu. And it's a very poignant photograph that Sandy Irvine took of Geoffrey Bruce and Mallory and Colonel Norton at that ceremony. And eventually they made their way back up to the North Col, and Sandy Irvine jigged together a rope ladder to allow them to facilitate that ascent. But now time was of the essence, and Norton and Mallory made an attempt that failed very quickly. They were smart enough to know when they couldn't make it, and they got back and retreated. And then famously, of course, Somerville and Norton made the assault, crossing across the face of the mountain to get to the couloir that now bears Norton's name. And Norton left Somerville behind, and Norton continued to within roughly 600 feet, I think it was, of the summit. But then he had foolishly taken off his goggles, and he began to suffer from snow blindness. And so he had to retreat, exhausted, and he passed Somerville. And as Somerville followed him down the mountain, he had to stop. And Norton didn't understand what the problem was, but as it was, what happened is that Somerville had to do a kind of a personal Heimlich maneuver, and he coughed up the entire frozen lining of his throat. And if he hadn't been able to do that, he would have died on the mountain. And of course, with his mouth dripping blood, he just continued down the mountain. Now, Norton had to immediately get into the darkness of his tent at Camp 4. But Mallory at this point was a man possessed, and I think he felt he couldn't come back without success. Curiously, but I think for some good reasons, Sandy Irvine to climb with him as opposed to Noel Odell. Odell had been a little slow on some of the outings on the mountain, and Sandy was ferociously strong. And so they famously left on July 8th and made a higher camp, and Jean Noel was tracking their movements with a telescope. Noel himself was much higher in the mountain in support. And as you said, he seemed to have spotted them surmounting what he thought was the second step and going strong for the summit in time to reach that summit and return. And that sighting, of course, is the $64 million question, because it was later questioned both by other members of the party, but also by Noel himself. And the key question is the second step. It's a 120-foot vertical slab of rock with tremendous exposures to each side, down to the Kenshin Glacier and 10,000 feet down to the West Rongbuk Glacier. Critically, when Conrad Anker and Dave Hahn tried to replicate that climb to see if they thought Mallory and Irvine could have done it, they concluded basically no. We also know that they were terribly dehydrated. They had lost their stove. They couldn't melt water. Irvine's face was terribly blistered. But the main thing is that modern climbers on the second step down climb by belaying from a rock, and the ropes that they had were probably neither strong enough nor long enough for them to do that. And Mallory could have perhaps free climbed the second step, but even Irvine, for all his athleticism, it's highly questionable whether or not he could have done it. And we know from the fact that Mallory's body was found with a rope frayed but tied around him that he didn't abandon Sandy, and he never would have abandoned Sandy. That would have been against everything George stood for. So I think most people would believe that if Odell saw them at the base of a step, it might have been the first step, because we know oxygen canister was found there, and that they probably got there and retreated and somehow took a fall across the yellow band. What became of Sandy's body is unknown, but Mallory was tragically found not too far from one of their camps. So, and he clearly was alive when he fell, because he crossed his leg in his death throes, and his body, the condition of his body suggests that the fall was not that far. So I think that would be the consensus. There's one wonderful possibility that's worth mentioning, is that if the snows that had pounded the mountain that fall had accumulated on the northeast ridge, And it's not clear that that would be the case, judging from the photograph taken of Norton by Somerville a couple of days before. But if they had, it's not inconceivable that the second step could have been essentially obliterated, as would be the case in September of 1986, by a kind of ramp of snow that would have allowed them to surmount it with the very haste and speed that Odell originally reported. And I think had they got to the top of the second step, nothing would have kept Mallory from the summit. He would have gone on even to his end, I think. But again, this all is in the realm of speculation. I think that the important thing is to give honor to Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing. And Sir Edmund told me at one point when I interviewed him, some part of successful mountaineering is getting down alive. And at the same time, we should give honor to George Mallory and Sandy, because we do know that they got higher than any human being had ever done before them, a height record that would last for 30 years. And they were the ones who truly unveiled the wonder of this mountain that captivates people to this day.
Wait, just to wind up. It's been 100 years since that June 8th, 1924 attempt by Mallory and Irvine. In that time, well over 5,000 people have now reached the summit of Everest, and some 300 have died in the attempt. So 2 questions really. What do you think has changed in both the kind of spirit and also in the practice of people attempting to summit Everest? And equally, second question, what do you think has stayed the same and remained strong throughout all those years?
What remains the same is the mountain and the challenge of climbing the mountain. The number of people attempting to get to the summit doesn't change the challenge of the achievement. I mean, the weather is ferocious. The death zone is horrific. The chances of dying ever present, So in that sense, I don't think we should trivialize even those who buy their way onto a commercial expedition. We live in a world of commodification, and we are buying experiences all the time. I don't think anybody who makes the effort to climb Everest should be disrespected. At the same time, there is a kind of commercialization of the mountain that one can't help but question. It's almost like, what's the point? And when you get to a situation where people are dying, as has occurred, simply because they're spending too much time in the death zone, as they have to wait literally in queue to go up or come down the second step or to traverse the final ridgeline of Everest, as we saw just recently in this month when that cornice collapsed and 2 men, but especially, a very experienced Nepalese Sherpa collapsed to their death. And the other thing I would note, that even while certain individual Nepalese climbers and Sherpa have achieved notoriety, fame, even sponsorship deals, we're still in a situation where a whole group of Nepalese climbers are putting themselves out in service of these Western climbers. And I remember that during one particular tragic May, I calculated that the compensation offered by modern tour companies to the families of the dead Sherpa in adjusted dollars or pounds was less than what General Bruce compensated the 7 Sherpas who were swept away in 1922. And so I feel strongly that, as many people do, that the Sherpa deserve a bigger slice of the attention of the pie, over the rewards implied in risking their lives to make all of this happen.
Wade Davis, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure.
This has been The Lead, a podcast from New Lines magazine. Into the Silence by Wade Davis is available to buy now online and in all good bookstores. And Wade also has a new collection of essays, Beneath the Surface of Things, also available to buy now. This week's episode was produced and hosted by me, Finbar Anderson. For more episodes like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do take a moment to rate us and leave a review. Thank you all for joining us, and see you all again soon.